Hello everyone, this is Mr. 13 Things coming at you with, we hope, is a pretty clever trick for you to hide some Ruby code in with your drawing. Now I wouldn't say this is the preferable way, but it's a way to go ahead and do some basic coding inside a drawing and then store the code in the drawing, and it's done by taking advantage of something called Sketchy physics, which adds some additional information or attributes to particular things. To demonstrate first, I'm going to go ahead and open up this object here and go through a couple things in SketchUp. This is a SketchUp drawing with, if I click on that, you see that's one. I'm going to go look at the entity info. That's something called floor. It does not have a name. And I've got some things here as I'm experimenting with names. Entity info, that's Jen. And I'll leave out the other names because I don't want to. Right, Jan and Mark, and this other one here, I have a name to it as well. So that said, one thing that you can do is make sure you download and install something called Sketchy Physics. And so Sketchy Physics does a lot of neat things, and when we're done with this, I'll kind of run through Sketchy Physics with this thing running before it explodes. But what you can do is you can then go to the, click on something and click on the user interface here. And what you see down here is an area down in this inspector that's scripted. And that scripted place is a place where you can bury some code actually. So in this case, what we're doing is this bit of code is actually defining the typical model entities and selection, and then going through each entity and assigning a value of false to 3 attributes, addition 1, 2, and 3, and the can list of attributes. And then putting to the screen the name of the list, and then the attribute for each thing and the attribute given to addition 1. So that's what this is doing. But what's kind of key here is the fact that you can have written this code, and this is not where the code runs from, however. You just go ahead and grab all this code now, and you go right click. Sorry, you kind of grab this code, hopefully coming across it, right click, copy, and now if you close out the inspector here, you get to the point of where you generally run code, and that is in plugins, Ruby code editor, and in here I'm going to right click, paste, and I'm going to get rid of those things. Alright, so it's just a way, this is where you're doing all your coding because it's a nice little plugin that lets you do debugging and do all kinds of other things through here. And ostensibly we're looking at this because we do want to look at different ways that you can get kids to kind of visualize achievement besides necessarily what they're given to themselves by Khan or by Darth Vader or any of the other great people helping us out on the internet. So with this running here, I'm going to go ahead and minimize this a little bit, and we're going to see what this looks like when it runs. Doesn't really do much, but we're going to go ahead and open up a window which is the Ruby console here on the left. So one is the editor, one is the console when it runs. So when we run this code, you can see that it runs Jen is false, Laurie false, and Mark is false. And if in fact you wanted to go back here and change the code within here, and you wanted to make maybe number 2 true for all of them, and now when you ran this, Jen false, Laurie false, Mark false, but I only changed addition 1 to false, and you see those the way they were. So eventually, obviously, each entity is going to have true or false for each particular attribute you want, and this is how one could easily, quickly learn to add attributes for students that weren't necessarily covered in the Khan database, but still keep it in this world where students can kind of keep and track their achievements. This, I wouldn't say this replaces what you might be doing. Hopefully it could augment it, but it gives some students some control as they start defining their own attributes. It lets them really play around with their avatars, because if you looked at each of these avatars, I'm going to go ahead and close this out and close. If you look at each of these avatars, they're the same. But what I'll do now is just show you what Sketchy Physics does, and it may explode here, and I'll regret that. if it does, but I'm going to go ahead and turn on Sketchy Physics, and there it is. It had a problem with it because it didn't know what to deal with some of that stuff. So Sketchy Physics would actually tend to let you kind of run things around, play around with them, but I'm going to go ahead and stop it. And if you notice there, it doesn't know what to do with that. So if we try again to clean it out, we can go back to here. And what it was telling me was it has a problem with those definitions because they're really not in the right place. So if we close this out here, and now this time perhaps we hit that, and we hit the Sketchy control panel, and now we can kind of move those things around, though they're not necessarily acting the way they're supposed to. So immediately, you know, kids can do a little bit more. You know, those are not necessarily acting truly like physics items, but you could have them defined as such. So that, once again, is a way to go ahead and keep code to review going the other way. If you're going plugins, Ruby Code Editor, you have some code there, and I'm going to go and kind of fix this up. Standard first 3 lines of anything that you're dealing with Sketchy Physics or with SketchUp would be to kind of set some of your basic list selection here, and I'll explain what these 3 things are in a little bit. It has to do with object-oriented programming. We're covering this for all kinds of different reasons. One of the major reasons is, in fact, object-oriented programming in use of JavaScript, and Python is how Khan Academy keeps track of a lot of the data for you and your students. So it's never a bad thing to kind of learn how some of the different syntaxes work, but in this case we can just do something like this and say entities.each. We're going to open up a loop, and then putting inside the pipe symbol, put screen entity e.name, and then close that out. Very often you'll be going off of different syntaxes or different programs you'll be copying. In this case, you're looking at something is called Ruby, and Ruby is a pretty powerful programming language, and it looks very much like, it works very much like Python. So underneath here, all this is doing is taking the current SketchUp active model and calling it model, calling each of the individual things inside that model entities, and calling any selection of things that you have selection, which is not used here. It is now running through for each of the things that are of the entities in here. It's going through and it's going to put the property name or the attribute name onto the screen. The screen in this case being here Ruby console, and when we run through this here, you see that put screen e.name for this little text up here, because it had a problem with that. I get rid of that, run through it again, and it ran through with names for each of those entities. Obviously those could be each of the entities in your class, all of your students together, and in all reality entire student body. If you really wanted to start to learn to have students organize and play with some of the tools that they have, to start to mimic the kind of thing that might be done for instance, tracking patients in a hospital, tracking vehicles on a battlefield, or in fact tracking our cars in a traffic jam as we get stuck in traffic going into a major city. So the types of things that we do every day when we turn on our phones. So once again, we could store this code if we wanted to. If we go to that object here and stick it in here, in the scripted place would be a place to hold the code. So we could go back here just using a typical cut and paste, copy and paste. I'm working on a Windows side of the Apple right here. Go into here, paste, and then when I close that out, it's saved. And so when I now say File, save this, it's going to have code in 2 places. Click on that. It's got some code which I stripped out of there, but I think I did put it in here. There it is. So that's the general process. That's 10 minutes. Once again, giving you something to do in case what you're seeing on the screen in terms of the formal, this is the way Khan does it, is not doing it for you, you can start doing it the way Khan does it. It's a pretty good model for managing data. Thanks for listening.